Inequality Podcast, the podcast on inequality research. Welcome to a new episode of the Inequality Podcast. My name is Gabi Spilker and I'm a professor of international politics and global inequality at the University of Constance. And next to me sits
Marius Busemeyer. I'm a professor of comparative political economy and speaker of the Excellence Cluster, Politics of Inequality.
Our guest today is Anke Hoeffler. Anke is professor for development research at the University of Constance and also part of our cluster, the Politics of Inequality. Anke is also a member of the Leopoldina, the German National Academy of Sciences, and received an Alexander von Humboldt Professorship, Germany's highest award for international research in 2019. Thanks to this professorship, the University of Constance was able to lure Anke away from Oxford and come to Constance, which we are really proud of. Anke's research centers on economic development as well as on conflict and violence. Today, we want to talk with her about her new book, Worse Than War, which she wrote together with her co-author, James Fearon. The book has just been released by Princeton University Press. A very warm welcome, Anke.
Thank you very much, Gabi. Thank you, Marius. Thank you for the invitation.
So, Anke, the title of your book is Worse Than War. So let's start with the question, what can be worse than war?
Yes, what could be worse than war? We are constantly bombarded with all of these sort of images of war, and it looks apocalyptic, so what could be worse than this? But what is actually worse is the sort of everyday violence that many women and children experience, so the wars at home.
That means that this is also violence that is in the context of war, or is that broader than war or complementary to war?
In a way, both, but a lot of most of the violence is completely separate from war. So I call it war at home because you were sort of asking about the title, but this is sort of what I think of. So the most common type of violence that women experience globally is from their intimate partner. By intimate partner, we mean their boyfriends or husbands. And the most common type of violence that children experience is parental violence. It's the physical punishment of children is the most common thing. And that happens at home. And this has got, per se, nothing to do with the war. But of course, once you've had a war, there's also more violence in society. So we know that sort of men who've experienced war are more violent, intimate partners, and also parents who've been at war are more violent towards their children.
That's empirically, of course, very challenging to measure that. I mean, we have all sorts of statistics about war victims, how many people die in violent conflict, both between states, but also within states. There are big databases on this, even though, of course, there's also uncertainty with regard to the estimates of war casualties. But how did you manage to come up with a measure of this violence that happens in homes? This is a lot of it happens behind closed doors, I would assume.
Yes, it's hidden in plain sight.
Yeah.
And it's very difficult to measure. And of course, the data are poor. But we thought it was worthwhile to do this whole exercise. 20 years ago, you wouldn't have been able to do it. But now we've got a lot of victimization surveys. Mm-hmm. So you can't rely on police statistics because in a lot of countries, victims are unlikely to go to the police because they don't trust the police. And so you need really a whole range of victimization surveys.
What are victimization surveys, Anke?
So where people are being asked whether certain things have happened to them. So, for example, in the past year, have you been physically assaulted? Has something been stolen from your property? Those sort of types of things. We obviously focus on physical violence here.
And these surveys exist in plenty countries so that you can compare that across the globe, I suppose?
Yeah, so comparison is, of course, really tricky because what would be theft in one country or assault in one country and what is rape in one country is not necessarily defined in the same way everywhere else. So you really need to have something that is comparable. And the demographic and health surveys, for example, ask women about their experiences. And the best way is not to ask in a general way, have you experienced violence, but it's act-based. So it's very specific. Have you been pushed? Has your hair been pulled? And so on. And who's done this to you? So these are the sort of typical questions in the demographic and health surveys that have been carried out in many, many different countries.
But it's it sounds a bit, to be honest, a little bit like comparing apples with oranges. For one, also there's problems of harmonization between different countries. That can be solved maybe if you ask the same questions to different people in different countries. But also on the one hand, war conflict is of course a completely exceptional situation for many people. And then on the other hand, this domestic violence is like, unfortunately, a thing that occurs every day. So it's very hard to compare these two if you want to get, it seems to me, at a measure of the total amount of violence that is in a society. How did you manage that? How can you compare these different things?
So you're right that we've got very good global databases on war. So Uppsala University in Sweden has sort of collected these types of violence data for a long time, and we know that they are comparable across countries. So they basically scrape media reports and sort of...
Scrape, what does it mean?
So they go through these reports and from Reuters and BBC and local media and sort of look for how many people have been killed and how many people have been injured. And so, yes, we do have quite a good idea about how many people die in war. We do also have quite good statistics of how many people die due to homicide outside of war, because there's a body of evidence. We sort of think that these are the most reliable data. So there you can't do a victimization survey. There you have to sort of rely on official statistics. Official statistics either come from doctors or from the legal system, from the police. And for most countries, they're not reliable, not the same. Yeah, so they are sort of, for political reasons, very often the legal statistics are much lower than the health ones from doctors.
Especially in countries that are not democracies, I guess, right? Or is there...
Exactly. So for the poorest world region, sub-Saharan Africa, we've got very little reliable data. So this has been a problem throughout the project. And so you have to sort of think in of believable ways. So you first have to define what you want to measure. Then you look what you can measure, what's available, but there's still gaps. And then you have to do imputation. So you've got to sort of do a statistical filling in of the data that you haven't got.
So maybe even more precisely, so how did you measure the cost of violence exactly? So you have these surveys, and then what do you do with the surveys? And so how do you get to a number that really tells us the cost of violence in country X is so and so high?
So first of all, you need to define what violence is, and that's already difficult. So what about child marriage? Is that violence? Yeah. So a child is defined by the UN as under 18. But in many different countries, whether she's 17 and a half or 18 years old probably makes very little difference. So you can make up your mind whether you think that this is something like statutory rape, because she shouldn't be married under the age of 18, or whether you sort of say, okay, any child married 15 and younger, that we would consider as violence. So you have to have a definition of violence. And we sort of are quite open about this, what we consider as violence and what we do not consider as violence. You know, reasonably, you could disagree with our definitions. And then also sometimes you just haven't got the data to sort of measure it terribly well. So we've got gaps in there. So you have that. You have the prevalence rate. So in terms of the sort of Uppsala data, the homicide data, and then the assault data, which we have from these victimization surveys. And then maybe that's all many people want to know. They sort of find out, yes, that women and children are much, much more likely to become victims of violence. And that's maybe where you want to stop. If you want to go further and sort of say, okay, what's the burden? What's the cost to society? Then you need to sort of think about how do we put a price on a life and on an injury? And then you multiply out these sort of cost factors by the prevalence rates.
Maybe we can just, on this point, I think this is a very important point because, I mean, especially from an economics perspective, you're an economist from your background, this is relatively normal to think about costs of human life, so to speak, right? I mean, these things that are in healthcare economics where you measure how much money you spend on certain medical treatments and how much you can actually generate in terms of benefits for this. But it's still something that might feel a little bit alien to people to think about the cost of violence in terms of economic costs rather than societal cost or well-being, or maybe I'm interpreting this wrong. So what is your definition of costs essentially? Is this an economic cost, or does this also include other types of costs that are more social?
So we have tangible costs, which maybe a lot of people sort of think of sort of something you can touch, you have to pay out of pocket for example, you've been assaulted and you go to a hospital and you have to pay for this hospital stay. Yeah. So that's a tangible direct cost. But of course, then you're not able to work. And that's an indirect tangible cost because you've got a productivity loss. Then there's, of course, more to this. There's sort of like the cost of suffering. There's a welfare loss to society. And so for these intangible costs of suffering, you might want to sort of consider how much is society willing to pay to avoid a death or an injury.
Okay. So you do provide a cost estimate also of these not purely economic costs.
Absolutely, yeah.
And very precisely, what is the cost? What is the price tag you put on that?
I found it very difficult to sort of put a price tag on a person's life.
Absolutely, yeah.
Because every life is precious, but it's not invaluable. And as Marius already said, we're making a lot of policy decisions on sort of like, is it worth saving this life or not? So you mentioned medicine, but for example, a lot of traffic departments do this. Yeah, should we sort of build an underpass? And it's costing so much money and so many people have been killed on this stretch of road. So we do it all the time. We're just not very explicit about it. So let me be explicit about it because I think it's helpful for policy decisions. Yeah. We use a system called the value of a statistical life. The value of a statistical life is a concept that goes back to Thomas Schelling. And their economists were looking at labor markets. So, for example, you have a risky job working on an oil platform, and it's a 1 in 1 million chance that you die in this job. Yeah. So you're demanding a higher premium on your job. And if it's $10 to make up for this risk, then a certain death would just be, statistically speaking, $10 million.
Mm-hmm.
I see.
And that's what economists use. And this is so it's not the value of your child's life or the president's life, but it is a statistical life.
So how much people would be willing to pay to avoid this, basically, right?
Is this similar as insurance companies would go about measuring the cost of life?
There are sort of different ways you could sort of measure it. For example, a life insurance premium would be an alternative way of doing it. But not a lot of countries have got these sort of life insurance data. And also, if you think about it, in Germany, a lot of people never take this, or their relatives get it on their death, but it's a sort of type of pension fund for them, and they cash it in when they're older.
I see.
We talked a lot about measurement now, and so maybe we can also come up with, or you can provide us with a little bit more concrete estimates on the actual cost of this. I mean, so we talked a lot about how to measure this, how to estimate, but what does it actually cost, so to speak, these different types of violence that you cover in the book? Can you come up with some numbers? I mean, of course, this probably varies a lot between countries. Some countries experience war, interstate conflict, and so on. Others not at all, but all the countries experience some kind of crime, some kind of domestic violence. And so that's already probably an important difference. But yeah, maybe you can come up with some concrete numbers, how much this actually costs in terms of percentage of GDP or absolute numbers. I don't know what.
Yeah, so I'm happy to tell you an absolute number, but maybe it's always important to keep in mind that I think the relative sizes of what we call interpersonal violence, so the homicides and the assaults and the sort of war burden, that's of much greater interest to me. So if we think globally, we've got $34 trillion in terms of cost.
Wow.
So how
that's
does
an
this?
immense
It's
sum.
a huge
Yeah,
number,
it's
and I think
number.
nobody can quite understand what it means. So it would be about $4,000 per person.
Oha. Okay.
That's
the global average, basically.
That's the global total for 1 year of all the violence that's happening in 1 year that we can measure.
Wow.
And how is this distributed globally? So is that, I mean, I assume it's not distributed evenly across different countries, but there might be countries that experience more of these costs or suffer more from these costs than others.
Absolutely. So there's a very unequal distribution. So Marius already mentioned war. War happens in very few countries. Yeah. When you're a conflict researcher like myself, you tend to forget this, that most of the world is actually at peace. So that happens typically in very, very poor countries.
Yeah.
It's the Sudans, it's the Afghanistans of this world where a lot of this sort of conflict, deadly conflict happens. And then the other type of violence, the interpersonal violence, so the very high homicide rates we see throughout Latin America stand out. But what is the highest, so proportionately, the highest share in violence is violence against women in every single world region.
Crazy. Sad.
You can sort of look at it in countries, world regions, or by income groups. And if you look by income groups, it's the poorer income groups that sort of have the much higher prevalence of violence. Not necessarily then cost, because it depends.
I see, yeah.
I know you wanted to get away from this sort of whole measurement issue, but when you sort of ask me about a number, it depends what is the value of a global citizen. So should that be the same number for every person? Yeah, a Burundian and a German having the same value, or maybe not. Maybe we should be sort of looking at the German labor market and the Burundian labor market and sort of get these values of statistical life. And I think it depends what sort of problem you want to solve. So we're sort of looking very much at the climate change literature, and there it's a global problem, and clearly we should value every global person's life the same. But if you want to solve a problem in Burundi, it's maybe much better to sort of say, if we want to go towards a cost-benefit analysis, to sort of value the Burundian life at the Burundian level.
That's kind of controversial, I can imagine.
Yeah, it is. And so how did you decide for the book?
We give you a choice, so we do both. And so, of course, because I've just sort of said there's much more violence in low-income countries. If you use a global value, then this is a much higher value. The 34 trillion. If you do it by country, you've got 23 trillion.
I see.
So it makes a big difference.
Also in terms of the share of the violence that's caused by interpersonal violence relative to the share that's caused by conflict.
Yeah, so most people sort of think, okay, war is the sort of dominant thing in the news, but we sort of find that about 12% of all of this sort of global cost that I told you about is caused by war and terrorism.
That means 88% is caused by something else. That is, so now I understand the title, Worse Than War. Just to get that straight, so that means that also the high-income countries are not free from this cost of violence. Is that correct?
Absolutely. So what's interesting in the high-income countries is that there's a lot of suicide. So you might again sort of think suicide is a sort of self-directed violence, that's not something that we should be considering when we talk about the cost of violence. But maybe you are. Again, we give you the choice. We sort of like put it in the different tables and in the different graphs. We sort of put it separately. So you were asking me earlier about who experiences most violence, and it's low-income countries and low-income settings. But with suicide, it's the other way around. It's the higher-income countries that experience higher prevalence rates.
Wow.
And maybe since we're here at the inequality cluster, do you also see some association with prevailing levels of inequality? I mean, there's the global dimension of inequality, of course, that we talked about a lot. But you also mentioned the difference between high and low income people within countries. Do you see some association between the cost of violence and inequality?
So we haven't looked further into how violence is distributed within the countries, because I think that would be another interesting research project. We were sort of more interested in the global inequality. So global in the sense of world regions and income groupings, but also men, women, and children. And sort of find that, yes, it's the sort of, if you're a woman or a child in a low-income setting, in particular in sub-Saharan Africa, you are much more likely to suffer from violence.
So on a global level, you've previously said it's women in all country contexts that suffer a lot. Is that correct?
Yes, intimate partner violence sadly happens in all countries.
And what about children? Is this confined mainly to the low-income countries, or do you also see that across the globe? And then the next question would be, what can we do about this? I mean, now that we have all these horrific numbers, what do we do with it?
So very often people sort of say it's their culture and it can't be changed and we shouldn't interfere, or it's sort of neocolonialism when we sort of present these numbers and sort of say, okay, that something ought to change. And I don't think it's a cultural issue. Sort of look back to German history, not the distant history. I was married in 1996 and rape within marriage was not illegal. There was no law against it. That was only in 1997. So sometimes it just takes a long time to change norms, but then, things can also rapidly change. Sweden was the first country that outlawed all physical punishment of children in 1979, and a lot of different countries then followed. And I think the experience that we've already had as children and our children now have is sort of education that is mainly violence-free. So it can be changed.
The policy implications is basically, I'm asking the conflict researcher, so maybe the question is less about war and peace on the global scale, but it's really more about this domestic policy interventions like educational measures, social policy measures, health measures maybe, that could be actually more effective in lowering the total cost of violence than what we typically think of when we think about conflict, right? Is that one of the implications of your book? What kind of policies do you have in mind?
Yes, so after coming up with all of these sad numbers, we've got 2 chapters on violence reduction and prevention. One on war prevention and the other one on interpersonal violence prevention. So at the moment, the international community puts a lot of effort into reduction of conflict. But when you actually look at the success rate, it's a pretty mixed picture. What we can do in terms of diplomacy, sanctions, aid, UN peacekeeping. That seems to be pretty solid evidence that we can keep the peace with UN peacekeepers. But at the moment, I don't see the international situation as such that we're going to see many more new peacekeeping operations. So given that we put so much emphasis on it, but it's so mixed, what we can actually do, I strongly advocate that we sort of look at what could be done domestically against violence against women and children, and also the high homicide rates. And you've already mentioned some things, but maybe you have particular interests in policy prevention packages.
We're very interested.
So weapons. You really have to reduce the availability of weapons. There's very, very good evidence that if you reduce the access to weapons, mainly firearms, because they're the most deadly weapons, then you reduce harm.
One interesting example I've learned about our neighbor country, Switzerland. There a lot of suicides happen because of the army weapons. Is that right?
Yeah, and there was an interesting, we call it natural experiments, but it's really a policy experiment. Yeah. The size of the army was drastically reduced in Switzerland about 20 years ago. And it's a militia army. So those of you who are not like us living next to Switzerland might need a little bit of an explanation. So people have very short army training and then they go home with their entire kit, including their gun. And Switzerland does have a high homicide rate, not just the sort of assistant dying. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about these sort of high suicide rates. So when the army was reduced, the suicide rate reduced significantly.
Interesting.
So some people use different methods to kill themselves, Some people are just determined to kill themselves, but it was dramatically reduced. And so that sort of shows you that the availability of weapons, the sort of spontaneous sort of, okay, I'm going to hurt myself or others, is highly dependent on the easy availability and access to weapons. In Switzerland, we've got a very low homicide rate, so you can't really see an impact on the homicide rate.
Okay, but on the suicide rate, what else can you do?
So what else can you do? You can reduce alcohol consumption, because alcohol makes people, on average, much more violent. And so a lot of intimate partner violence is accompanied by drinking or other substance abuse. And so these sort of partner programs that have become very popular to sort of address this type of violence, again, we have got very mixed evidence on this, but very good or much better evidence for the programs that address substance abuse, because typically both partners very often when they're young, so it's much more prevalent in young couples because this sort of locus of control isn't as established in teenagers, and also they are physically more matched. The sort of idea that there's, and I get this a lot when I talk about this, of course, men can also be victims of domestic violence, but because they are physically stronger, typically they cause much more harm to women.
And what about broader measures like education and social policy?
Yeah, so everybody likes the idea of I educate you about alcohol and then all the lobby groups are happy about this, but there's no evidence that this works. You've got to really reduce the availability of alcohol. You've got to sort of say typical sort of violent scene is pub closing times, people spill out into the street, pushing and shoving, and one thing leads to another. So that's a typical dangerous situation. But for example, you can have plastic glasses, because glass is being very often used as a weapon. And so there's sort of little things, or sort of alcohol around football matches, for example, reduces violence. And you can make alcohol more expensive. So we've got very good evidence from Scotland where there was a unit of alcohol has got a minimum price, and that people are then consuming alcohol in a different way, because it's not the glass of wine that you have with your evening meal that's dangerous, but it's the binge drinking. It's this sort of episodic heavy drinking is sort of what the World Health Organization calls it, with high percentage alcohol, vodka and schnapps and so on. That makes people more violent.
Yeah, actually, I was also referring to education in a broader sense, right? I mean, because you mentioned the value orientation that plays a certain role, changing values. And of course, that's maybe also this topic of neocolonialism that you mentioned, that people or countries might be quite reluctant to accept suggestions on how to redesign the education programs when it comes to gender relations, for instance, or family relations, when this advice comes from the outside, even if it comes from the United Nations, I guess. Do you have any ideas what we could do in this regard?
So as a professor of development research, I've long come to the conclusion that you cannot change anything from the outside. Has to come from the inside. But every single country has got NGOs, social movements, people who are sort of saying, okay, this has got to stop. We can't have all of these children being hit by their parents, caned regularly, or also all the violence that goes on in schools. So you've got to sort of try and support these champions that exist in every single country. And it's interesting that a lot of the sort of violence reduction research happens in high-income countries, and it's now slowly being sort of taken to low-income countries. So by that, I don't mean forced upon, but sort of like if you're a champion, I can tell you, okay, we know that this and this works. Would you like to sort of try this and sort of then adapt it to the local circumstances? So, for example, in the United States, we've got extremely good evidence that dating programs work. So this is for teenagers aged 14, 15, before they typically have their first romantic relationship. And so it's not about sex education, it's about relationship education. It's sort of what is consent, how do you have an argument with your partner, how do you resolve conflicts, and so on. And so we've got very good evidence that this is for girls and boys at this age. When you sort of survey them later, they've got much lower rates of intimate partner violence. Now, that doesn't translate, the concept of dating doesn't exist in every country, but, it's sort of been countries like Kenya and Haiti that have had very good success with these types of programs.
Very, very interesting. Maybe a final question now that you have put all the numbers together, as well as provided a very good overview of what works, what potentially doesn't work, and so on. What do you do with this knowledge? How do you get this knowledge across, and to whom? Whom do you target as one of the experts in this field, and how to make really a difference for this very, very important field?
So what can you actually ever do as an academic? And how do you sort of have an impact? I think you can just sort of try and sort of change and then sort of see whether this snowballs. Our podcast seems to be a good start. when I first started doing this sort of economic research on conflict, this wasn't something that development economists were doing. And you just have to be patient and sort of go with your message to different policy shapers and sort of see whether it gains some traction. And sometimes, despite all the odds, so my first article, Greed and Grievance in Civil War, with my then supervisor, Paul Collier, it took 5 years to publish. And because nobody wanted to sort of hear anything about this topic.
And now it's one of the most cited pieces in this field and really a seminal article in this field. Yeah.
Thank you. So, sometimes it sort of seems unlikely and certain things then sort of take off. With a reputable publisher and a book, I will hopefully be able to distribute the message widely.
And we hope that this podcast helps in distributing this important message. We thank you, Anke, very much for this super interesting conversation. We learned a lot about the cost of violence and that this is potentially indeed worse than war. Not to say that war isn't bad, it's really bad, but other forms of violence also exist, as we learned, mainly targeted against women and children. And we also learned what can help. And now we hope that many listen to this podcast, that many later on listen to what you have to say, maybe read the book, and we keep our fingers crossed that the world will potentially be in better shape in the future. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much for having me.
And to all our listeners, please tune in every first Wednesday of the month.